Welcome to Pencils and Lipstick. This is a podcast for indie authors. I'm Kat Caldwell, novelist, short story writer, and book coach. Here on Pencils and Lipstick, we're obsessed with all things story, and it is my goal to bring you the writing tips that you need to make your novel come to life. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Pencils and Lipstick. This is episode 255, and today I have an interview with Janice Hardy. If you don't know Janice Hardy, well, you're about to get to know her, but she created Fiction University. She has a wonderful newsletter that I suggest all writers subscribe to. She has been in this business for a really long time, has been writing for a really long time, and giving writing advice for a really long time. So I'm excited to have her here. We are going to talk about premise. And I wanted to have her come on and talk about premise because I think that it's something that's pretty misunderstood in the writing world. And I think a lot of times indie writers, especially, really like to buck the system. I mean, obviously, we're not even going traditional, right? But I think in bucking the system, we can sometimes throw everything out. Let's say, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I think that the premise is something that will really help you getting through the muddy middle. And I don't want to give too much away because Janice and I get to this in the interview. I have to admit that when I was starting out writing, when I was younger, I, rebelled against every single writing advice out there. But I've been thinking about the premise a lot as I help coach people through their books and mostly their book ideas and sort of getting everything kind of, if not outlined out on paper, but really understood and organized in their heads. And I think that we keep coming back to really the core of the story. And that is a lot of times the premise. And so I've been thinking about this and I'm putting together something where we might get into like the practicalities of finding your premise in a couple weeks. As you guys know, I'm going to be leaving for India in just 10 days as I record this. So let's get into the interview. If you guys are new here, it would be really wonderful if you would like and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening on. If you want to see me and my guests, you can get on YouTube at Pencils and Lipstick and listen to the interview there, watch it there. It really helps. If you can give a review, that also helps, obviously, with the algorithm. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, but I'm not as active over there. You can get on my newsletter. The URL is below. You can also get on Janice Hardy's, which again, I really, really recommend. Her blog, Fiction University, has a plethora of writing information and writing tips. If you are ever stuck or you ever don't really understand something that other people are saying, please go to fictionuniversity.com or blog.janicehardy.com and you will find all the information that you could possibly need. Next week, I am talking with Stacey Juba about editing and self-editing, as well as finding that editor and what to expect. And all the things. She's been an editor for a really long time. So we're talking about that. I think editing is also something that sometimes in the indie author world, we want to think we don't need, maybe. And I would advocate that we all need a little bit of editing. And the week that I am in India, the 24th, we will be talking with another author. I'll be talking with Roland Denzel, and he's kind of an email friend of mine. I'm excited for you guys to get to know him and the different experience that he has, especially writing nonfiction. And now he's writing fiction as well. But, this is especially for all of you who want to know a little bit more about nonfiction. So let's get into the interview. Before we do that, Janice Hardy created Fiction University as a way to pay forward the support and advice she received during her path to publication and to share her love of writing and passion for helping writers improve their craft. She tapped into her own dark side for her young adult fantasy trilogy, The Healing Wars, and created a world where healing was dangerous and those with the best intentions often made the worst choices. Her novels include The Shifter, Blue Fire, and Darkfall from Blazer and Bray HarperCollins. Her nonfiction book, Planning Your Novel, Ideas and Structure, is was out in 2014. She actually has a new book that she's working on that will be coming out as well that she will be talking to us about. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. There we go. Hello, Janice. Nice to have you back. And we're already talking about fiction, so we might as well record.
Absolutely.
And let everyone else listen into it. So when I talked to you last, I think we sort of ended, we were talking about premise, and this was like 2 years ago already, unfortunately. We need to talk more often, but ever since I keep coming up against writers who either don't think they need a premise. I wonder if they don't really know what a premise is. This thing seems to be very scary for writers sometimes, and you are not afraid of premise. You write about it quite often on your blog. So I thought I'd have you on to talk about it.
Excellent.
So let's start with like the basics. What to you, like, how would you describe to an author that's starting out, or maybe an author who's a pantser and they have like a character and they start writing and then they're like, I don't really know what I'm writing anymore. How would you explain to them what a premise is and why it might help them?
Good question. There's a couple of different ways you can approach that. Like in my mind, I always think of the premise is what the story is about.
Mm-hmm.
But I am a plot focused person. So the premise to me is the concept within how you are going to explore the plot. But for a
Yeah.
pantser, for them, especially if you're a strong character writer, the story may be about a mother overcoming the grief of her child. Well, that's kind of still a framework, and that is a premise and it is a framework, but it's not a plot framework. So you may have trouble trying to write from that if all you have is here's conceptually what I want to do. So I
Mm-hmm.
think you can approach premise in a lot of different ways, but at the core, I think the premise is, to use the core word again, kind of the core of what the story is about. What is the concept that you want to tell your readers? What is the story, more or less, kind of thing? Not even the story, because your story, you could have a lot of different stories from a premise. So I think it is kind of like the conceptual nature of your idea,
Right,
to
right, right, right.
I kind of think, which is, I'm not sure how helpful that is to somebody who doesn't know what a premise is, but like the premise is kind of, and movies are really great for this, I think,
Yeah.
because they encapsulate a premise so quickly. Because you'll have like Miss Congeniality, where the premise was, the tomboy FBI agent has to go undercover in a beauty pageant in order to catch the bad guy. Like that's a great premise. And I think what makes a good premise is kind of also what makes a good hook, I think, is that when you hear it, you can kind of instantly get a sense of what the story is going to be about.
Right.
Even if it's something simple, like what if Peter Pan grew up? That was the
Yeah.
movie Hook. And
Yeah.
instantly when you think Peter Pan growing up, your mind starts spinning out all kinds of things,
Yeah.
kind of thing, which is great. What if you had Romeo and Juliet as zombies? That was
Yes.
warm bodies. Like I mean, like you get those things. So kind of like that premise is that sense of here is an interesting idea and a framework in which you can tell a story that can go in a number of interesting places. So I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
probably what I think the premise is one of those things that I don't know if you can fully write a story until you can figure out what your premise is, because it is kind of the heart and soul of your story. And when you're lost in your story, you can always come back and go, well, what's my premise?
Right. I think like as a pantser, you can start out as a pantser, but I always tell my clients and anyone who will listen, like at some point you have to sort of sit back and really think about what your story is about. Like where is your story going, right? So if it's about a mother overcoming her grief, I would say you add on to that by taking a road trip through India, or or like
Yeah.
something that will at least help you remember where each scene is going, right? Like at least you understand like the overcoming grief. Okay, that is like we're not going to stick a clown in there, or maybe zombies, maybe I don't know, but
Maybe, yeah. You
you
could make it work.
never know by fighting the zombies. But at least you sort of keep that idea, because I do think pantsers sometimes have this, they can still lose that essence that they started out with sometimes, because life happens, something funny and or sad or whatever, and we get very influenced by our surroundings. So if you have that sort of premise at least written somewhere around. You go, oh yeah, that's right. That's what I'm writing about.
Yeah,
I'll
this
have
is
to
the core
get,
story. This is the thing that got me excited to write this book. This is what interests me, which is
yeah.
why it's hard to really define. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that say the premise is X with a definition, but so much of writing, what I've discovered is you'll have one word or one term, and there's like 9 different definitions of it depending on context. And I think premise is like that.
Yeah, maybe that's why we try to avoid it. But the more I look into it, I was looking at Eric Bork's course, and he's a screenwriter, and they do log lines, right? Like you can't
Mhm.
sell your screenplay unless you present your log line first. And that is really kind of a lot of times I imagine it being the thing that they put on the movie poster, right? That like you
Usually
said,
it is, yeah.
the thing that like makes you go, oh, okay, I know what that is. The underdog is going to go fight the aliens to make sure we all don't die. Like I can imagine something about that, right? Can go in a million ways, but so it's interesting how you can't sell, like nobody will see you unless you send them the log line, and how so many times writers are like, yeah, but I don't know. They have a hard time talking about their book. Like how many times have you talked to an author and you're like, what's your book about? And they go on for like
Mhm. It comes down to like the premise is kind of like the framework of what the story is going to be. Maybe I'm not even sure. That's kind of the plot for me. It's a really tough word. Like here it is, me doing this, and I'm still throwing out 7 different definitions of it. But yeah, it's like that idea, and I think it falls a little differently again, depending on what type of writer you are. I think you're going to approach it differently. Like I
okay.
think maybe your plot writers are going to approach it more with like, what the plot is going to be about, or
Mm,
the concept that you're going to explore through the plot, or the idea you're going to explore through the plot, where a pantser might be like, here is more of a thematic element, here is the theme that I'm looking through and I'm going to explore that theme, but they don't know what the plot's going to be because they haven't figured that out yet, because they have an idea and a theme but they don't have a conflict. And then your plot writers are going to have, oh, we have a plot and we have this, but we have absolutely no idea why the characters are going to be doing this, because we're not character writers, or so they have trouble coming up with character arcs or themes or,
right.
motivations or things. Like they have different hindrances and different weaknesses depending on like how you approach. And then there's people who, get it all right and get it all wrong. So you have a sliding
We don't want to
scale
talk about
there.
those people.
Yeah, you have a sliding scale there between like, I know it going in and, oh my goodness, I have no clue. Let's write, see what happens. And then I'll sort it out afterwards.
Yeah, no kidding. But you've written quite a few books at this point. You write several different genres,
Yes.
and you've been writing for a long time. And you say, have you always been a plotter? Have you always like
Oh,
had
always, always. Yeah, I always think in
really?
plot. Like I've gotten much better with characters, but characters, I joke that I plot my books, but I pants my characters, because I
Mm,
always have a general sense of who they are in the beginning, but I don't know who they are until I throw them into situations and see how they react. So they're always very very two-dimensional, very kind of loose, kind of, loosey-goosey all through a first draft, because I kind of have to write them first. And then I know who they are, and then I know how to shape them and treat them. And sometimes I figure them out really quickly. Like there was a little children's book I was working on in middle grade, and I'm still struggling with the main character, what he wants and how his agency and why he's in the story, and like how does he approach things. Like I know his role in the story and he's my
uh-huh.
narrator. So like he's my protagonist and I know his role, but I don't really know him that well. But his 2 sidekicks, his 2 friends, like I got a really good handle on them really, really fast. I'm good with
Interesting.
sidekicks. I don't know why, but like sidekicks are easy for me. And like I really understand those characters, but I don't understand my protagonist yet. And I might not even get him until draft 2. But
Really?
I'm gonna have to figure out who he is, but I need to see them in action first.
I think that's really interesting to hear that, because if you're a character first writer, I hear from most of, like, I'm character first, I see the characters and then I have to figure out the plot and what they're doing and why they're there. Um and I feel like sometimes character first writers think that the plotters have it easier, but it does. I think we just have like a different issue,
It's
like
just
what
different issues.
it's
Yeah,
just a different issue. Like,
there are.
how do you figure this out? And to think that you can get through your whole manuscript without really knowing the main character. I mean, most of us get through our whole manuscript without really knowing the plot. And then we go, oh yeah, that's not going to work.
That's gonna work, yeah. Well, I mean, everybody's going to be different, but I think it's a lot easier to change and adjust a character
Really?
than the plot, because the plot is, I mean, the plot is what happened, but the character is the one who's driving it. So you
Yeah.
kind of go in there and you can kind of look, and this is actually what I'm doing with the revision I'm working on right now, because we changed a couple of really fundamental things. So when I go into a scene, the scene's unfolding exactly. I mean, everything happens the same, but my characters, all his internalization is going to be different. All of his
Mm,
views, how he sees the scene is going to be very, very different because some fundamental things change. And I find it much easier to be like, well, okay, how is he going to approach this? And it's like, okay, well, he's going to do this differently because he has different motivations, he has different attitudes, he has different knowledge coming into the scene. So he's not going to do X, Y, and Z. So what is he going to do? And how is that going to affect the plot further on? Because the characters are the ones who are actually, their choices create the plot. So if I know
interesting.
what my plot is, I can kind of figure out, well, either how do I create a situation that sets up the choices he needs to make in order for it to come out the way I want, or is he going to make different choices that's going to slightly change the outcome? And then I have to kind of adjust downstream. And now when
Okay.
that happens, that gets a much more serious
Intense.
revision, because things change, you know, when you get those one little ripples and they change everything, and it's nightmare.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
So
but I
when,
like having that framework of the plot, because at least I know what I'm working. You know, it's like guardrails. You know, it's like those little bumpers in the gutters when you're bowling. As a kid, you know, it's like you're heading towards the pins. You might bounce off the sides to get there, but you're not going to roll over into the other, you know, the other lane.
yeah, yeah. No, I find this really fascinating because there's so much information out there for writers these days. We've gone literally from very little in the early 2000s, right? To like being inundated with all this information. And sometimes I think it can be really confusing on how easy some people try to make it sound. like
Mhm.
like find your character, their internal conflict, their external conflict, make sure every scene is, you know, pulls on all those strings, and then it should go here, and then you should have your plot and all of a sudden you have a book. And it's really difficult to keep all of those things in your head while you're writing the first draft. So it's nice to know I'm not alone.
You're
in,
not. And there's this misconception, I think, that we need to know everything when we start. And this is coming from a
right.
hardcore plotter. I mean, like, so if I'm saying this, you know that, you know, because
Yeah.
I really plot everything out. But we don't. The whole point of a first draft, it's that brain dump. It's to figure out what's in our head, get it on the page, and find out how the story unfolds. And we're going to learn a
Mhm.
lot while we're doing that first draft. And I think the longer we do this, you know, obviously some long-term authors and stuff. I remember being at a book festival, and I think it was Chelsea Yarbrough. I think it was there, and she was talking. And I mean, this woman's been writing for 40 years or something. And somebody asked her how many drafts did she do, and she says, one. But you know, you've been doing it for 40 years. She has her
Right.
process. She knows her stories. You know, like that makes sense if you've been writing professionally for that
Yeah.
long. But then you'll have other people who are like, well, you know, for sometimes every book's a surprise because every book unfolds differently. So,
Hmm.
you know, if you're writing the same characters, the same type of story, if you're writing like a long running series, chances are the more books you do, the easier it's going to get, because you have your
Right.
formula, you have your structure, you know your characters so well, you know what the story is like. You've got all your ducks in a row before you go in. If you're writing different characters, different books, different ideas, different genres, every book's going to be a different challenge.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to
Yeah.
reinvent the wheel kind of every time. So like it could easily be where it'll be much harder and you'll need more drafts for one. And then
Yeah.
some books are going to be tougher. And sometimes like what you think you're writing turns out to not be what you're writing. And
Isn't that a surprise?
yeah, and you realize that like halfway through the book, and you go, well, shoot, this isn't the story I thought it was.
Hmm.
Now I'm going to have to go back, you know, and then you have to decide, well, do I want to write the story that I'm continuing to write, or do I want to go back and turn it into this new story, or, you know, am I going off on a tangent, or did I have a happy accident and find something much better than what I originally
Right.
planned?
That is so true. And I think even when you have the idea, so there are a couple books that I've written where like I had the idea 5 years before I could get to a premise, before I could get to who am I writing about, before I could actually get to like a plot. It weird, you know, like in the meantime, you're writing other things, but it's like always back there. So I guess what I want to say is like half the time you get the idea, you have the premise, and it still might end up being a book that's like, wait a minute, that's not how I thought it was going to be.
I always joke because I said that I could rent my husband out at conferences because I joke that he's premise boy because he
Really?
just comes up with, he's always giving me book ideas. It's ridiculous. Actually, the book I'm working on now, we're developing it together because it was his idea. He came up with this idea. He had this premise. He says, and what else? And he put this thing out there. And I literally broke out in goosebumps. I'm like, I have to write this book. But it's really, really technical. There's a lot of computer stuff involved in this. And he's the computer
Oh,
guy. This is not a book. I need him in there. And like he had this whole incredible world. He developed this thing, and then we kind of worked together. And I'm doing all the writing aspect of it, but it's definitely a collaborative process. As opposed to the other middle grade fantasy that I was working on, where we were in the bookstore and he mixed up two different titles and said, "Oh, that's really funny. I thought this was blah blah blah," and this entire story unfolded in my head based on the title.
wow.
And that's the other one that I'm revising this year too. I've been in revision hell for years. It's terrible. But yeah, but like, so he always comes up with these ideas. And like, we were driving down and like, there's stories like, I don't like, oh, that one was obviously it came in me, but he has some other ideas where it's like, oh, that's a really cool idea. I have no idea what the plot would be. I have no idea what the characters
Yes.
would be, but the concept is really cool. And I would love to explore that premise. I'd love to explore that concept. I don't have enough information yet. And then like we'll be joking, we'll be out, or I'll read a book or see a movie, and I'll get another little piece, and I'll go ooh.
Mm.
And I have a folder that has all these, it's a file on my desk, and it has all these ideas and all these concepts. And sometimes it's a line of dialogue, or it's a character, or it's something, and I just keep track of all of this. And eventually, enough ideas get fleshed out in these premises and these different ideas, and enough gets there where I can actually write the book.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes. It's so nice to hear someone else say this.
I don't think it's that uncommon because, there's
Yeah.
some books that you're not ready to write them. And even
Right.
if you write them the first time, I have a friend of mine who wrote a book, and she wrote it as a YA years ago. And it wasn't a bad book, but it was like, okay. And she put it
Mhm.
aside because she's more an adult writer and she just did this. And uh, with her publisher, they were looking for some different books. And just for whatever reason, they wanted her to write something a little different than the series she'd been working on. And and she's like, well, I have this other story. And she has completely updated it and she's turned it into an adult novel and she's changed it. And because of the way the world is now, gives her some really interesting things that were not available when she wrote that book first 10 years ago.
Oh,
It is
that
a
makes so
much
much sense.
stronger book now. It is I wish I could say more about it, but
Yeah, we're all excited to hear
it's
it.
like it will come out one day and then we can be like, that's the book I was talking about because it's really
Yeah.
fantastic and she's done a phenomenal job on it. I'm very excited she's almost done. And it was a book she could not have written then.
Right.
Like it's so much better now because she was not ready to write that book back when she originally had the idea. It just wasn't the right time for it. And now is the right time for that book. And there are modern themes and modern situations and just things that have happened in the world over the last several years that absolutely layer into what her original premise was about.
That's
And it's
that's
just
a
deepened
fascinating
it.
concept. Like she's almost like ahead of her time. I think a lot of times artists are
Mhm.
without knowing it, right? So then you kind of have to get to the you kind of have to make choices then as a writer because you can have ideas, you can find the premise, maybe it's not time for you, you can't find the plot. You can either force yourself to work on that. Maybe. I mean, in her case, it helped in some way, right? It was still written, even though she had to rewrite it.
Yeah, and she pretty
Sometimes
much
it's
scrapped it and started over. But
yeah,
yeah, because so much
exactly.
changed. So much
Exactly.
changed because it was a completely different book.
That's
But
so funny.
because she'd been through it, she knew what pitfalls didn't work. She knew what things did
Right.
work. She knew what aspects of the original story she really liked that she wanted to continue with. She knew what stuff,
Yeah.
no, I didn't care for that. And she had all the characters. The characters are the same. I mean, she tweaked a few and made them better, but a lot of the
Yeah.
characters. And again, the concept, the premise is the same thing.
Right.
It's the same premise. It's just a completely different approach to it. And she was just able to grow it up and layer it with so much. She's not really a literary writer, but she's much more to the literary language character writer than I am. So her
Mhm.
characters are always super deep and all kinds of really interesting thematic elements and more of a literary type bent to it than I am. So she really was able to layer all of those things in, and you have a book that really resonates on multiple levels, which is fun.
Wow.
Like it makes you think. It's not just like I write fun adventures, and yeah, if they make you think, that's wonderful, but like let's go out and have a great old time. I write the Jurassic Park, Michael Bay, type
Yeah.
thing. Well, I wish I write Jurassic Park's fabulous. Wish I could write that great. But I write the fun popcorn type things, and she writes the deeper things that you think about, right
Yeah.
after,
Yeah.
even though they're great adventures and they're fun, but yeah, she's a much deeper than that. So
Well,
it's
it's
fun
it's
also to know
curious.
what you like to write too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it might make somebody listening think if they're working on something that doesn't feel like maybe it's not the right moment or somehow it's not working, to just put it away maybe and work
Yeah,
on something else.
absolutely.
Like, I don't think every time that you're writing, if you were kind of created to write, like you have this thing that you have to write, like, I mean, we could all go work somewhere else, whatever, but somehow those of us who write are like, no, but I have to write this story, like nothing that you write is wasted, right? Like you're just
Yeah.
honing your skills and maybe you'll use it later
Yeah,
on.
and maybe you'll use it later. Maybe it's, what was it, Edison or whatever? Or one of them, you figured out 100 ways that didn't work.
Yeah.
There's some scientist, I don't remember who it was, but yeah, that was
Yes, yes.
you found out 100 ways that don't work. Writing's kind of like that too. Okay, I found out, here's a way not to tell this story. Here's a way that didn't work. But if I didn't explore that, I'm not going to figure out what did work, because now I
Yeah.
know what I didn't like about it. And yet
Yes.
it totally feels like you wasted. I mean, even I know better, and I've said that, oh, I wasted like 2 years working on this story and I couldn't make it work. And it's like, well, no, I mean, like
Yeah.
I spent
Yeah, it still feels like, yeah, it's
it
like
does.
that emotional, we're still artists, you still have to. So how do you, with this notebook of ideas that you have, and if you can find the premise, do you really wait until you can have, like, you can see a plot before you start working on it? Like what would you tell another writer that's like, yeah, I'm full of ideas too? Like, what is that thing that connects the ability to start writing, I guess?
I think it's going to vary by author.
Okay.
For me, I really need to know what your core conflict is, what is the problem that needs to be solved.
Okay.
Because if I don't have a plot, I can't write a book.
Mm-hmm.
Like I need to know what the conflict in the plot is for me. And I can figure the people out that go around it, but usually it's like, well, I usually know who my protagonist is. Like who is the
Mm-hmm.
person who is involved in a problem and what do they have to do to solve it? Just your basic core. And
Okay.
that's kind of what I need to use. And then I can start figuring it out and playing with it and trying to do things. And I think you're gonna have some writers who are all about coming up with the character. I have this
Mm-hmm.
wonderful character, they're struggling with, and then they may be like, well, what about this character's life is problematic? What is
Yeah.
this character struggling with? And, maybe they think in character arcs, and you might have somebody who might be like, oh, I'm really, really interested. Maybe something personal happened to them, or they saw a movie or read an article and they're like, wow, I am like really interested in how somebody recovers after a traumatic event. I want to write a story that explores that because this is really interesting to me. Okay, so who would be, and then they start thinking of like, maybe they look at the plot, well, something like that. You probably look at the character first, but they may even look at the plot. I want to look at somebody who's trying to recover from a traumatic event, goes down a dark hole and ends up committing suicide, or ends up going crazy and doing something awful, or founds a foundation and helps millions of people. I mean, like however they want to
Yeah.
go, you could go any direction. And then they might go, okay, well, I know the general outline, the general sense of how the story is going to unfold. Now, who do I put in it? What are my plots? So you can approach it in a million different ways.
Yeah.
And I think I'm sitting here going, what was our question? But going back, um, I think that where the notebook and the notes and keeping track of things is, I think that at least with me, and I've heard this from several other authors, is you start collecting the pieces and eventually you get to that point where that story kind of stands up and says, write me
Yeah.
next. I'm next, because I've got a lot of books that I was like, oh, I'd love to write that story. I really think it would be a cool book. But this book is really singing to me. Like this
Yeah.
one gets me excited. This is the
Yeah.
idea I really want to write because I'm fascinated. I want to read this book. I want to see what happens in this book. And I think that you'll have those books, and some of them will really just jump out and grab a hold of you and demand to be written. And those are the
Mhm.
books you should go with, because passion always leads to passion. I mean, it's like if you don't
Yeah.
really care about a book, if you don't care about how the story turns out, your readers aren't going to care about how your story turns out.
Yes.
So the
Yeah.
more excited you are about it, the more that's going to translate into the writing, and then that's going to, show up on the page, and then it'll hopefully your readers will pick up on that and be just as excited about the book.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. And I mean, I think we can generate so many ideas that they can't possibly be used in our lifetime.
Oh, I know. Not unless we're James Patterson and have our whole stable of writers. Uh,
Seriously.
which, oh, I'd love to have that. Let's just clone me and have all these things. But yeah, I mean, ideas are the easy part, which,
Oh,
and
that's a good.
I know there's people out there that are going, what? Come up with any ideas? How dare you say that? But I think ideas are easy because ideas are everywhere. They may not be good
Mhm.
ideas. They may not be ideas you can do anything with, but ideas are everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think when people are struggling with ideas, sometimes it's not that they're struggling with ideas. I think they're struggling with ideas they think are good enough to write a book they can sell.
Ooh.
Because, and I think that, and
Yeah.
I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I think that even if they don't realize that, I think that's kind of the thing. Because
Yeah.
I run into a lot of writers who'll be like, well, I have this idea, but it's just that, and they kind of, you can hear that they don't think that idea is that big a deal.
Mm.
And sometimes, maybe it's not the most original idea, but it has interesting things in it.
Right.
And
Right.
an idea doesn't have to be original or unique to be a great book. I mean, like look at how many times Romeo and Juliet has been told.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Or
been told with,
the
on
natural
stage singing.
disaster end of the world has been told.
Yeah, natural disaster, end of the world. I mean, like there are so many things, and you've got like those archetype stories and those trope stories. And there's a
Mhm.
million stories you can tell within that. It's like your idea doesn't have to be your premise doesn't have to be unique as much, but like what about your story is unique to you? Like what do you bring to that story that's going to show a different aspect of it or make somebody think about that story in a way that has not been done before?
Right.
That's what you're looking for. So, it's okay. No, granted, there's going to be times where, like, say you have a vampire story and the market is completely flooded with vampires. It will
Mhm.
be hard to sell that story. Doesn't mean that story is not really good. So there's a
Yeah.
difference
Yeah.
between what you can sell and what's a good read
So true.
too.
And then this world of inundated with social media and being very like I think hit in the face a lot with the opinions of the world. I think sometimes writers are like, but what should I write? And yeah, I think it goes back to what you said a few minutes ago. It's like you should write what makes you passionate because that is the connection that you will have. Like your readers will feel it if you aren't feeling it with your story. Like I don't
Yeah,
see how you could be that good of a writer to be like, I hate this story and readers love it. I don't know if that
do
has
it.
ever
Yeah,
happened.
yeah. I mean, there's probably people who can do it, but I think it's tough. Again, I think if you're later in your career, you can probably do it. You can probably be better at it because you get to a point where it does become a job and you are
Mm,
doing a job and your skills are at a level where you're doing it. So you may not be excited, but it doesn't mean that book wouldn't have been better if you were excited.
yeah,
And so I think
yeah,
if you're still new and starting out, if you're writing a book, that's why I think writing towards trends is probably, not really a good idea. Because by the time you get the book out, chances are the trend is gone. But it's also if the only reason you're writing is to capitalize on a trend, you probably don't understand the trend that well unless this is something that you're reading and excited about anyway. You're not going to be passionate, excited about the story, and that's going to come across. So you might write a book that's okay, it might even be pretty decent, but it could be better. It could be
yeah.
more. It could be, and again, if that's not the book of your heart, if that's not the book of what in the type of thing you want to write, so now you have this book out. And what if it does actually do well in a genre, in a topic, in a trend that you don't like?
Yeah,
What do you do
that's so true.
next? You
You're
write
gonna write
something
another one?
completely different, and then all of your readers who want this book are going to be unhappy because this book is not that book. And then, or you're starting over with the other book and having to rebuild your whole audience. So there's all kinds of like professional, logical reasons why that's not a great
Mhm.
idea, and emotional reasons why, maybe
Right.
it's a great idea
Yeah, that's true. I
because you are
actually know
building an
somebody
audience.
who that happened to. and she was not happy about it. And she's
Mhm.
like, I have to like finish this whole thing out. Actually, I think I know a couple that it just sort of happened, and um, it makes it more of a job. Really, it makes it more of a slug. Anything that you aren't excited to sit down in this chair for, whatever job it is just a job at that point, right? So even writing can become like a slog if you're
Oh,
not
man.
excited.
And there's going to be times when it is and times when it isn't. There's going to be days when you're like, I don't want to be at the keyboard and you're banging your head. I mean, you're going to have that every day. And then there's going to be days where, you've been writing and hours have gone by and you're like, oh my gosh, like what happened to the
Yeah.
day? And you're all excited. Or you're writing things in your line and all you want to do is like call your friends and your writing buddies and go like, you're gonna hear, I gotta tell you this
We
line.
live for those days.
Yes, they're like the best days. And it's wonderful.
Yeah.
And that's, but yeah, I mean, writing's hard.
Yeah.
Writing
Yes.
and publishing is really, really hard. And if you're not enjoying it, if you're not, really loving it for most of the time, it's like,
Mhm.
why would you put yourself through
That
that?
is so true. That is so true.
Mhm.
So as somebody who's been writing, how many books do you have out now? Do you know how many?
I'm trying to think. Let's see. I have 8 nonfiction, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Oh, I guess I have 8 fiction.
Okay.
That's right. I
All
had
right.
2 chapter books come out this year, so that gives me 8 and
You've
8.
been in it for a while. So
I've
when
been
did
in
you
for a
start
year.
writing?
I published, I think The Shifter was published in 2009. I think it was 9, 10, and 11 was the trilogy. So I think I got my
Okay.
agent in 2008.
And you've done traditional and indie, right? Correct?
Yes, yeah, my trilogy was traditional. That was with Balzer and Beret HarperCollins. So that was
Mhm.
big, well, big six back then.
Yes.
And then my urban fantasy Blood Ties, and that one was indie because that
Okay.
has kind of a vampire twist to it, and that was kind of a fun book. I had been writing a book that I was trying to make work and couldn't make it work. And I'm going to finish. This is one of those books in my heart. I'm going to get this book to work one day because I really love the idea and I love these characters. But anyway, but trying to make it work for so long, and it made me not want to go to the keyboard. And that's when I shifted over to write nonfiction. And then I wrote
Mm.
Plotting Your Novel. And then I was like, I need to get back to fiction. And my husband came up with this idea. We were driving to Arkansas to see his mother for Thanksgiving, and he went, "Hey, what about?" And I'm like, "That's a great." And then we do these things. We call them bubble realities, where you just kind of have a reality, and then we just spitball and brainstorm how all that would work. And we were kind of doing this, and we're like, "That would be a really good book." And he's like, "Well,
Oh,
you should write
interesting.
that." And I'm like, maybe I will. So for Nano, I started it and I did it for fun. I was never going to publish it. I was going to do it. I'm like, this is for my husband. This is a fun book. It's just for a good time. And then when I was done, I'm like, this is not that book. This is kind of interesting. And I gave it to my agent and I said, all right, I have the story. And she says, love the idea. She says, it's 2 years too late because it had a vampire twist and
Oh,
vampires and everything. And I told her, and I said, well, I have this book, but I'm going to go indie with it because I know there's a readership for it, but I don't think there's a publishers are going to buy it because the market
right, right,
is
right.
saturated. And she's like, tell me anyway. And I told her, and she's like, yeah, you're right. And I was like, told you. So I went ahead and put it out. And it's like my passion project. It's out there. It's fun. I really want to write more in the series, and one day I will.
Nice.
But there's other stories I want to write. And then the
Nice.
chapter books are traditional, but they're with Learner Publishing. They're an educational publisher.
Okay.
I had an opportunity where they were looking for actual children's authors to write books for elementary students to teach reading.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
but they wanted, normally these are written by educators, and they're like, let's get actual storytellers. And they were trying to,
Right.
from what I understand. So it's 2 ghost stories, and it's um, Cabin 13 is haunted, and Who's Haunting Who. And they have these series, and the series that I wrote these 2 books on, it's a haunted ghost camp.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was a work for hire thing. So it was like, we're gonna, it's like, here's this, and I had never done work for hire before, so this was fun.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, and we want you to do like ghost stories. And
Interesting.
so I came up with the ideas, and that was there, and that was a lot of fun. And so and then, so you have the stories, but it was also, these are other things writers can do. You had these stories, but then each book had to also teach some aspect of writing. So for one of mine, it's teaching compound words. So I had to use a lot of compound words
Oh,
in
wow.
order to show and teach kids how to use and read compound words. So there's this whole added challenge, which made it, and these are like
Yeah.
6,000 word books. So they were kind of like this puzzle, and it was a lot of fun to do. And the other one was prefixes and suffixes. So you're
Oh,
looking
wow.
for ways to do this, and you're checking
Yes.
like, third, fourth grade, something like that. So you're like, okay, well, what are the vocabulary lists and what are
Yeah.
this? No, I can't use that. That's a sixth grade word. They haven't learned that yet. And it's a whole different approach to writing, which was a lot of fun because it was like this whole puzzle. So like, how can you do this whole story, use these words, use this, and keep it at 6,000 words and make sure that it's an entertaining story? And it was a really interesting exercise. Because
Yes.
you totally have to approach storytelling in a very different way. And it was a blast. I loved it.
Oh, that sounds very fascinating. There are a lot of things that you can do as a writer that you don't have to just like slug through a story, write it. I mean, I say slug. We all actually enjoy writing it most of the
You
time.
still slug. It's
And
still
then
slug through it.
there is still a slug part. We're both
Oh,
we're both in revision hell, so that's probably why we're like it's hard. Um,
revisions are tough.
and they are rough. Especially when you decide to, rewrite one third of the story.
Oh, only one third. Oh, I feel so. Yes, definitely.
Tossing it.
Oh.
And then coming out with the launch, the indie, the selling, or traditional or whatever. There are a lot that's really fascinating to think that you might look into writing for hire and just approaching storytelling differently. And it must feel good to be like, I'm actually helping kids enjoy learning to read and enjoy
It is.
story.
And I love that. It's very rewarding, especially if you're a kidlit author, because there are these different avenues and stuff and it's fun because writing for kids, I mean, like, yes, I love all my adult readers and my adult fans. Mwah, love you guys all. But the kids are really, it's amazing because you do. I mean, I got emails from kids who were like, I never really was much of a reader, but I read The Shifter and now I really like books. And, what else do you think I could read? Or, and, I would
That's
get
the
emails with
best.
kids because it's very fast paced. It definitely appeals to, like the reluctant readers,
Mhm.
because I like plot, I like thrill, I like
Yeah,
keeping things moving. And so it definitely appealed, and it appealed a lot to boys too, which was a surprise.
that's great.
So it
Yeah.
was one of those that was like really great. And yeah, it, hearing that, getting the emails and the stuff from kid readers is like a whole other level.
Yeah, it is. Oh, that would be
It's fun.
wonderful. Those emails are the best. I have a folder in my on my computer that I wish
Oh.
was bigger, but I love those
Oh,
emails of
and
like,
when you're having a bad day and you get a bad critique or there's a bad review or you just are struggling with something and you're like, I can't do this, I'm terrible, I'm a complete and utter failure. You go back to the fan mail email folder and like you just read everything and it makes
yes,
you feel better and you go, yes, I can do this. Like
yes,
you save it for those days when like you really need that pick me up.
yes, exactly. So for these two books, because you were doing it for hire, did you have to come up with the idea and pitch it to them? Like, did you have
Yes.
to? Okay. So you
Yeah, they
had
asked
to
for
know what you were going to
multiple.
write about, and they
Oh
had
yeah,
to
well,
approve it.
this one they had three different series. They were doing, I think, 8 books per different series. They had a detective
Okay.
series, they had an animal series, and they had the ghost camp series.
Nice.
And I guess, and I said, yes, I would love to write for one of these series. And they looked through my stuff and said, oh, she writes sci-fi fantasy. Like she would be good for the ghost camp. So they said, pitch us ideas for 2 books in the ghost camp series. And I
Okay.
gave them 5, 6 different ideas. I forget, they asked for certain, and I asked a bunch. And there were a couple that they liked, and there were some that were like, no, no. And then there were a couple they liked. They said, oh, but can you do this? And there was like that back and forth. And they're like, we like this aspect, but we don't like that aspect. Can we do this? Can we do that? Um, and and then we just kind of went back and forth until they had a couple of ideas and like, yeah, we like those ideas. And we're talking like 2 or 3 sentences,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a paragraph. Like they did not want a lot. It's not like they were dictating the plot or anything. They were dictating the premise.
The
They said, "Oh,
premise,
now
right? Oh, look, we're
circled
back.
back so nicely, didn't it?" Yeah, they wanted, they wanted me to come up with a premise and a,
Yeah.
general sense of the plot, and then they wanted, outlines and stuff. And then we
Okay.
did the outlines, and then they went, oh, and then they made, a little bit of feedback, but not terrible, again, like these were my stories.
Yeah.
It was like working with with a critique group or an editor. Well,
Right.
I was working with an editor.
Right.
And so they were suggesting places, for the story to go, or, things in the story, but it was still my story.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and they
Oh,
were,
that's interesting. Well, it's fascinating to come back to the premise because I think you said it way in the beginning when we started talking of like it gives you that feel. And I
mhm.
think we all have that innate storytelling feel, like gut, and when you read a good premise, you're all on the same page all of a sudden. It's
Yeah,
like,
you just know, and you're like, oh, I can't wait to see what those, and like Blake Snyder in his whole Save the Cat
mhm,
beat sheet format. One of my favorite things that I love that he calls the middle excuse me, the promise of the premise,
Mm.
which also may help you understand what premises is. And he uses miscongeniality a lot as an example, because it is such a it's a great movie and it's well put together and it's well structured. But if you're going to see miscongeniality, you want to see the tomboy FBI agent in, as the beauty pageant contestant, struggling, falling on her face, having a hard time with it. That is the promise of the premise. You
Mm.
come to watch this movie, we're going to show you the hijinks of this undercover FBI agent who doesn't want to be girly. And the whole middle
Right.
is her doing that.
Yeah.
You go to Jaws. The promise of the premise is we're going to show you a story about this shark who's terrorizing everybody, and they're trying to catch the shark before it eats everybody in, at Amity.
Yeah,
Like
that
whatever
makes
it is. If
sense.
you're going to Jurassic Park, we promise you a story about dinosaurs going crazy in a theme park.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the premise. So like that is the promise, and it's such a great way to look at it. And he's so brilliant for coming up with this, is that it really hammers in on this might be a good one. The premise is why readers are going to want to read your book.
You're right. Right. Right.
I'm going to have to
Right.
write that down.
Yeah. We'll take it from this. That's so true, because at that point, your middle is not a struggle anymore, because what you're promising the reader is the tomboy FBI agent being a tomboy, and then by the end of the middle, learning how to not so much be a tomboy, right?
Yeah, learning.
Like
And with her whole character arc was learning how to be who she was to achieve her goals.
in heels.
And her whole thing was she was denying her feminine side because she had
Right.
to be one of the boys. She thought she had to be
Right.
one of the boys to be an
Right.
effective FBI
Exactly.
agent. And she
Yes.
learns over the course of this that the more she pushed to be the tomboy, the less effective she was. It was only when
Right.
she embraced her feminine side and realize that women have power too. She has feminine strength that she can bring to this job that makes her a better agent, because she sees things in ways her male counterparts wouldn't. And that
Right.
enabled her to do her job better. And that's how she learned in the end of it. So
Right. Right.
it just, everything ties together and makes that a really emotionally rewarding story.
Oh, yeah. That's such a good way to look at it. We are going to have to just take that one part of this podcast and we'll just publish that.
I know. What did I say? What did I say? I was like,
Yeah,
that's right. The
at least
premise
it's
is
recorded.
what readers expect from your story. I literally have to write it down so I don't forget.
Yeah.
Really like
I
that.
mean, really, it does a lot to solve that middle, doesn't it? And as you
Yes.
keep going and you keep breaking it down into, what does your character have to learn internally and externally, and how does that all tie together? And as I always say on the podcast, writing takes as much time thinking, so you're just going to have to think about how it just keeps tying and your promise.
Oh, it does. It's funny. I have lots of stories. I know a lot of writers, so I do talk about my other writer experiences. So forgive me for that. But I have a writer friend, and sometimes she gets frustrated because she feels like she's not being as productive. And I'm always tell her, I'm like, you write the first draft in your head before you put it on paper, because she does. I've known her 20. This is not the other one that this isn't. I have several writer friends I've known for 20 something years, and she talks through every scene before she writes it. She has to think about it and figure it all out. And she literally she writes the book in her head before she puts it on paper. And she always forgets this. And I'm
Yeah.
always reminding her, like, you are doing a lot of work. It's just not on the paper yet. And like, as soon as you get that all worked out, then she actually writes really clean first drafts, because
Right.
so much
She
mental
wrote it up here.
it's so much mental, and she may think about it for a week and then like write 3 or 4 chapters and then think about it and then write, and then it goes back and forth. It's not like she does the whole book in her head and then she goes down. It's
Yeah.
pieces, but she always has to think through it and figure it out. And like that's really important. Like you're saying, like there is a lot of writing that is mental, and we're thinking about things and we're working things out. So sometimes if we feel like we're not getting anywhere or feel like we're not achieving anything, we might be doing more than we think, because it's not
Yes.
always typing on the keyboard. Sometimes it's figuring it out in your head so that you can, when you get to the keyboard, you're productive.
Yes. Yes. I think this is something that I've been struggling to not just say, but actually believe for myself. Right.
That's the hard part.
Yeah. It's good to have those friends. It's good to remember your process, and it's good to realize that the people that, I try to say, like, the people who can push out 12 books a year or more, they're kind of the unicorns, but we love to
Yeah.
hear about them because we think like, oh, it's actually achievable. But sometimes I
Mhm.
feel like it's more detrimental if you just can't, if you are not one that can do that. It's better to accept the way that you write. Like, I
It is.
overwrite, I have to then go back and toss, and because I'm looking for my plot and my characters, and so I might actually write double the amount that I need, and then I go back and I have to condense it and throw it out and rearrange, and I don't know, one day it might be better.
Well, yeah, I mean, if that's your process, you go with it. Yeah, and like I don't have any problem. I think it's healthy to evaluate your process from time to
Mm.
time and try things. And I've actually noticed within the last couple of months, like when I first started writing, I wrote really short and I
Oh, okay.
always had to flesh out because I was all focused on the plot. And then the more I've been developing my character side, the longer my books have gotten. And now I've discovered that I write way long and have to cut everything back, which
Interesting.
shocks me because I never used to be like that. And then I had a discussion with my agent recently. We were talking about like she was looking at the middle grade and she was like, "Oh, the ending made me tear up, made me so happy." And then I'm like, and then but she's like, "Yeah, but the beginning has a problem, like a whole problem with the setup and how I have to like redo things to set the story up to take advantage of that ending." And
Yeah.
then it dawned on me that back when I wrote Shifter, my beginnings have always been super easy for me to write, and the endings were my nemesis. I always had to write the endings 3 and 4 times. I could never get them right. And that has flipped now.
Oh, that's so
So
interesting.
I'm like, this is really interesting. In the last 20 years, my process has changed. Like, I
You're
mean,
like, I don't know what to
I'm
do about
waiting.
this.
Like, when am I going to turn into a character writer now? Because like that's would be the next step, right? So it's really interesting. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, well, whatever I've been doing to get my endings to work better, I obviously need to keep that. But now I need to take some of the things that she's been talking about. I'm like, okay, now I need
Mm,
to rethink how I'm approaching setting up my inciting events and
right.
starting my stories and everything. And of course, these days everything's shorter and everybody wants that faster, which could be part of it. Is
Right, right,
they
right.
want
Oh, it's
that
just,
within the first chapter, you know.
yeah.
So yeah, if you're out
It's
there writing books, get to the point fast, and publishers want shorter books. No more
shorter, but
giant long books. Paper prices are too high. That's my my modern
that
tip.
is the truth. That is the truth. But it's interesting how everything evolves, even us as writers, our process, like you said, like just keep reevaluating it maybe and
It is, yeah. You know,
keep
as long
going
as
back to it.
everything's working and you're happy with it, it's fine. But if you get to a
Right.
point where you're like, gee, you know, I wish I could do X, or I feel like it's taking too long to do Y, or if you're just not satisfied with what you're doing, you know, sit down and evaluate and go, okay, well, what am I doing? What are the things that I do that I like? What are the things that I'm not happy with? What can I try that might make an improvement? And then pick one
Mhm.
thing. You only want one thing, because if you do more than one, you're not going to know what works. This is my computer guy husband speaking here. Do one thing and then evaluate it, see what happens, try it for a month or whatever your time frame is, and then see if it makes things better or worse. And if it's
Mhm.
working, they go, okay, let's try another little thing and then see if that works, or say, you know what, that one thing fixed my problem, I'm happy now, I'm more productive, I'm writing better stories, I'm getting more emotional resonance, you know, whatever it is that you're
Right.
looking for. But yeah, I mean, it's art evolves, you
It
know,
does.
we evolve as writers and process
Yes.
evolves.
We get
So
older.
definitely play with it, try it. Never
Everyone,
give up.
everyone needs a software husband so that he can remind you to say,
Yes,
just
my
try it one thing at
professional
a time.
geek. My professional
Otherwise, it
geek.
all breaks.
Oh, it does. Oh, I know. It's like he's great to have around. Besides the whole premise point thing is
Yeah,
definitely
no
fabulous.
kidding. He's a great partner for a
Oh,
writer.
he's a great resource, and asks wonderful, wonderful questions. So
That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Janice, so much. I know we've covered so much
mm.
on this episode. I hope that people are excited to maybe try one thing, excited to try maybe fleshing out their premise. We will have links to your blog and your newsletter, which I love, below so that people can keep up with you.
Awesome, thank you. All right, bye guys.